first in our series of virtual conversations on clean energy in the age of coronavirus. You can find more information about the series on our website, greenenergyohio.org. And also please watch for the email announcements that we will be sending out about future conversations. We're very lucky to begin this series with two accomplished journalists, Kathiann Kowalski from the Energy News Network and Dan Gearino from InsideClimate News. Their bios are online, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time this afternoon going through that, but suffice it to say that they both have a wealth of experience covering, following clean energy issues in Ohio and elsewhere. I think it's extremely important for Ohioans to know what's happening in other states and what's happening nationally so that we can gauge our reaction here. And for that purpose, I rely heavily on Midwest Energy News and US Energy News, both of which are published by the Energy News Network. The same thing is true for climate. There are so many publications out there right now that cover climate and the intersection of clean energy and climate. But I find InsideClimate News to be very reader-friendly, very informative. And then there is Dan's Clean Energy newsletter. So I would urge our audience, if you are interested, these are free resources that are available to you. So sign up and see what you can learn from today going forward. I'm going to kick off the discussion with a few questions for our guests. And then we will open it up for the rest of the audience to ask questions as well. And I'm going to go through a few logistics just so I get it right. I'm going to look at my little cheat sheet. Everyone will be muted unless you are asking a question. If you would like to ask a question, you need to push the little raise your hand button on Zoom, which you can find at the bottom of your Zoom screen. If you click on participants, the list of participants will come up and that little icon will be at the bottom. Select that icon if you have a question, and then when you're called on, you will be unmuted. You can also ask a question through the chat function, which is at the bottom of the screen as well. So with that, I'd like to begin the conversation with a broad question for both of our guests. And then I'm going to go into a little more detail about some of the stories they've been covering. We've all seen photos and news reports about how stay-at-home orders have improved air quality, reduced carbon emissions. I think I saw in the Washington Post yesterday a projection of between 4% and 7% in 2020. The stay-at-home period seems to have proven that we can make a difference in what's happening to our climate. But what do the two of you think? What about the lessons we've learned? Are we going to be able to use them, to apply them to clean energy issues going forward? I'll start with Dan and then move to Kathy.
So the question you ask is one of those questions that, of course, we're all asking, and I always like to begin a conversation by saying that the truly honest answer to almost any question, forward-looking question like that is, we don't know. So then once we kind of clear away the kind of doubt that we all have when we're talking about the future, I think we can say a few things pretty clearly. One is, if you look at the past when there are economic shocks that affect greenhouse gas emissions, once the economy gets up and running again, humanity just kind of makes up for lost time. So it's usually a big spike. And there's a real question about how much of the current emissions cuts are going to be enduring and how much, so that's the past. At the same time, there are some things that are different now. This isn't like those other times. This isn't like the 2008 crash. One of them is this technology we're using right now, like just the availability of video conferencing, really easy, free video conferencing. People are more able to work from home, which means they don't have commutes, which means they're not in their cars as much. And I think when this is all over, there are a lot of employers and there are a lot of employees who are just going to say, you know, I don't want to go back. Or maybe I only go into the office once a week for a meeting. And if that happens on anything approaching a large scale, that is the kind of thing that would move the needle. There are larger issues like how this is affecting the electricity market, how it's affecting electricity prices, and different specific forms of electricity. And certainly right now, coal power is taking a real beating in the market. The entire electricity market is really suffering in a lot of ways. But I think the big thing is we're learning what we need and what we don't necessarily need to do our jobs. And that means more people will be working from home, I think, even when this is all over.
Agree. Kathy, what would you like to add to that?
Yeah, those are all really good points, especially, you know, the concern about rebound. The things I've seen do suggest that people are going to want to work at home more often, even if it's a matter of only going in 1 day a week. And there's already some talk I've heard in seminars for employers about how they might try to shift the workplace and adjust for, you know, maybe they can save on office space too. I think there are two other things that come to mind for me. One is that this whole pandemic, I mean, and I don't think I'm alone, but I think a lot of us worried, okay, at least I have electricity, at least I have water. What's going to happen if those go out and I'll be screwed, right? And I mean, this is a real fear. And I think one of the things that this whole thing has done is maybe get people more concerned about contingency planning. And distributed energy is an element of resilience. So in that sense, I think there might be some traction that the clean energy industry might be able to gain, but a lot of it's going to depend on framing. And I think one other thing is that even before the pandemic started, there were indications largely driven by the rise of natural gas over coal, but there are indications that economic growth isn't necessarily in lockstep anymore with greenhouse gas emissions. So that's one other note for hope.
Thank you. Thank you both. We all need notes for hope these days, for sure. Yes, Kathy, yesterday, Midwest Energy News published your article about how COVID-19 is making the need for a just transition. And we talk about that a lot for communities left behind by the decline of coal. It's making the need for that transition even more apparent and more urgent. What are some of the specific ways that renewable energy and energy efficiency might factor into that? Especially given the fact that the clean energy industry itself has taken a bit of a hit during all of this. And what kinds of policy shifts could actually help advance that transition?
Those are good questions, and questions I want to dig more into. And, you know, so one of the things I saw was the Energy Information Administration is forecasting coal is going to be down this year, but even with the pandemic, they were predicting growth in renewables. And so to me, it seems that as you look forward towards a recovery, and I think recovery will take several years. I'm not thinking this is going to happen overnight, but I think that the clean energy industry could offer some both short-term and long-term possibilities. One is, as there are more wind or solar projects added, there's a lot of short-term jobs that come with that don't necessarily require super high skills, for example, in construction and all that. And that would allow for some job growth in the short term. Longer term, I think gets more challenging and needs a mix of different approaches. Because once things are built, it takes fewer people to maintain them and keep them going. First, if anybody on the call has anybody on their staff who's worked in the coal industry or come from a coal town, contact me afterwards. I would love to hear their story. But beyond that, you know, there will be a need for training. There will be a need for, you know, people to maybe upgrade from a high school education to maybe get an associate's degree or a bachelor's degree or some sort of specialized training so they would be able to have these better paying tech jobs. Likewise, if we can, as a state, attract more manufacturing, and again, perhaps the let's source local emphasis of the pandemic may be in here, that could be another stimulus that may be helpful for some sort of green rural electrification plan that one of the economists I spoke to was talking about. But then policies have to factor in too. Ohio has been rather hostile towards wind energy in recent years. Some of the regulatory proceedings I was reading through, even where solar projects were approved, you're starting to see some of this opposition of a nature akin to some of the wind opposition that we've seen. So those policies, I think, would have to shift. I think we would need to also have, you know, maybe some state funding for retraining, more emphasis on the state to trying to cast itself as a clean energy state if it wanted to really be competitive for more of these companies looking for, you know, where can we source clean energy. The Appalachian Manufacturing Hub that would have been part of the AEP project didn't take place because there wasn't the critical mass yet, but you know, maybe some sort of focus on that. And I guess one last comment before I turn it over to Dan for his thoughts is, you know, states don't exist in a vacuum. And I've been hearing this thing for years about, oh, in Ohio, we're this, and in Ohio, we're that. And it seems to me that a lot of political leaders may not be facing the fact that Ohio actually competes with other states. And I looked up the unemployment rates this morning. Right now, and this isn't just Appalachian, statewide, Ohio is tied for 9th as of April for the highest unemployment rate among 50 states and the District of Columbia. That's not something we should want to be a top 10 on.
Right.
Dan, what are your thoughts?
So in talking about the idea of a just transition, and I should say that the term just transition is now so common that it's like, it's a term we all use, but there's something about it that kind of, I'm just uncomfortable with it because it seems kind of, there's like this kind of almost PR speak and kind of social work speak that's in there. But that said, with that disclaimer, I think if you're looking long-term for how to make a transition in regions that are seeing their major industries fading, the one thing I've seen from writing about this for a long time is I think that regions and regional leaders need to be really careful about being overly enticed by kind of shiny objects. And so, okay, if your big employer, and whether it's a coal mine or whether it's an automotive plant or whether it's the idea of replacing that with one big company that you're going to give a ton of money to and that you're going to just say, okay, mission accomplished, we solved it, is almost, the majority of the time going to end really poorly. And it seems like the more successful approaches are thinking about job training, investing heavily in community colleges, thinking about what are the jobs of the future going to be and how do we position our region to have those jobs. Thinking about what industries actually have workers, as opposed to industries that are actually very kind of employee light in terms of the total their total spending. So yeah, I think this idea of when we talk about the just transition for the transportation change, the change from away from internal combustion engines, and the talk of that is going to be so much bigger, because when you move from internal combustion engines to other motors, it transforms the entire infrastructure of car repair and car retail and car manufacturing. I mean, just things are different, and it's just going to reverberate. There's going to be new jobs in some places, and there's going to be fewer jobs in other places. And I suspect that the conversation we're having about coal country and making the transition will be, it'll be like 10 times that as we talk about, and when it's more clear that we're in the midst of a similar transition in the auto industry.
Thank you both. And when it comes to policy, we might get a signal of some sort today. The Ohio Power Siting Board is looking at the application for the Icebreaker Wind Power Lead Co project on Lake Erie. This would be the last approval, I believe, that they need before they can move forward. So hopefully that will be a good signal at the end of the day. Dan, I want to move from what is more local to global. You recently published a series of articles based on 20 years of experience in Germany with green energy, clean energy. And I saw a video in which you said, and I'm going to quote, "What Germany shows us is that the effort is multi-generational. To make it work, you can't think of it in terms of the next 6 months. You have to consider the trajectory for the next 30 years. Americans and American policymakers in particular are notoriously bad at thinking ahead. They react to crises. They are reactive, not proactive. COVID-19 has made us once again realize the need to be proactive and think ahead. Do you think that some of those lessons that you saw in your coverage of the German experience could be applied in the United States?
So the short answer is yes. The long answer will take like 15 days. So actually, no, I'm just kidding. So Germany and the US, if you're just out and about in Germany and you didn't realize you were in a foreign country, you would think you were in the US in large parts of Germany. When you talk to Germans in terms of a lot of the values, in terms of a lot of just the way of perceiving the world, we have a lot in common, and we can learn a lot from each other. They can learn a lot from us. We can learn a lot from them. And in that, I mean, you're getting right at it. The kind of the big thing that the U.S. needs to think about this energy transition in multi-generational terms. And the question of can we do it, I think it is tied closely with this the level of partisanship you see and this kind of the tribalism of political debate. One reason the energy transition got off to such a kind of a rollicking start in Germany is it had strong support among in various parts of the political spectrum. It was not a super partisan issue. And we're in this point in the US now where in a lot of places, like wind energy is partisan, solar energy is partisan. Which is strange. Like there's solar panels. I mean, there's a wind turbine on my grandparents' farm, and that's the dollars they get from that is not Republican or Democrat dollars. But I think that the lesson that the U.S. can draw, and maybe as there's more income from renewable energy kind of going into more places, because of course rural America is where that income goes. That's where we have room to build utility scale solar and wind. If there are ways that people who actually live in rural America can directly benefit, then I could see maybe a gradual shifting of the way this has become partisan, and that would be the lesson for the U.S. Or that would be that to make the transition that is going to happen, that's going to happen whether the U.S. wants it to or not. It's going to happen in other countries. the question is kind of, is the U.S. going to lead? And is the U.S. economy going to manage this transition in a way that's good for American workers and good for American people? And that whole question of, can this be, can some of the major tenets of an energy transition be the kinds of things that in opinion polling would get 85% support, you know, where it becomes not non-controversial essentially. And I think that that's what, looking to Germany, because there's plenty of controversy about the energy transition there. It's just not quite so partisan. And that's what I think the U.S. can learn just period. Whether they learn it from Germany or not, I don't know. But and is kind of the key lesson for me.
Thanks. Kathy, did you have
Yeah.
any thoughts on that?
Yeah, when I reported from Germany a few years ago, I was struck by the fact that their utilities were already looking at how were they going to structure themselves going forward, and where were the business opportunities, and how could they do that. And so they were looking to provide, you know, energy efficiency as a service and load management as a service, and really getting into how to be viable as businesses moving forward. What we've seen in Ohio is, you know, like, yes, we had House Bill 6 that provides support for a different kind of utility business model, but it's not, you know, it's not one that's ultimately going to be as beneficial for clean energy as it is for other types of energy. The other thing that strikes me is that, you know, Ohio actually has more parallels with Poland, where you had this reactionary, we're going to cling to the past. We're going to cling to coal because this is our tradition. This is our history, even though coal jobs were way down there as well. And I think that what we may need is perhaps to start thinking about infrastructure as we look forward, maybe deal with some of the big gaps that we have in connectedness in the state, certainly for telecommunications, which a lot of energy depends on. And, you know, I think in keeping with Dan's original comment about looking forward, maybe it might be time for politicians in Ohio to stop focusing as much on Bob and Betty Buckeye, who admittedly go vote, and maybe start thinking about the Liams and the Benjamins and the Megans and the Kylies and, you know, all these little kids running around now, and what kind of legacy do they want to create? Maybe people need to start framing it like that.
Yeah, I agree. I'm going to ask another question, but I want to remind all of our audience that if you want to ask a question, if you have one in mind, please, now's the time to hit that little hand button or type it in chat, and we'll see what we can do. In Dan's original, the answer to his first question, he talked about the transition to in vehicles, in transportation. And Green Energy Ohio, I'll put a little plug in here, we're planning an electric vehicle tour for next spring around the state. Kathy, you've written about several proposals in the General Assembly that would incentivize EVs and hybrids, as opposed to what many people felt was the punitive aspects of the registration fee. And of course, the real need is for infrastructure, for charging stations, so people can have broader range and feel more secure. Unless you own a Tesla, that can be a little frustrating. So do you think this is an area, again, and going back to the whole question of bipartisanship that Dan just mentioned, is this, are electric vehicles an area where we could see some bipartisan progress in Ohio, especially since there may be some production here in Ohio?
One of the things that's heartening to me is that there are already steps moving forward to use some of the facilities in Lordstown and to have a battery plant there and get some of that industry going. In a survey last year by the Yale Climate Communication folks and I think it was Climate Nexus and George Mason, they found that a majority of Republicans, Democrats, and independents all had favorable views of electric vehicles. I mean, it was up to like 3/4 or 2/3 to 3/4 across the board had favorable views of electric vehicles. And majorities also said, yeah, if I get a $7,500 credit, that will incentivize me to go pick an electric vehicle over another kind of vehicle. I think that we can have some benefits here if we phrase it in terms of economic development. Perhaps utilities can buy into the concept that this will increase electricity use. It won't go over so well with folks in the petroleum industry, but I think that may be one factor behind AEP's support. Maybe, look, this is making it easier for people to actually use electricity.
Right.
If you have those charging stations. I think, again, we need to watch out for pushback and perceptions that these are high-end vehicles. There was a proposal I read about where one of the senators was trying to say, oh, maybe we shouldn't allow this for cars over $45,000. Well, it doesn't mean a lot when the average new car cost is about $39,000, right? You're already talking a pretty steep amount. And so I think, yes, I'm optimistic, but I also would be careful about how it's phrased. And I would phrase it and frame it in terms of economic development, because that's what this state desperately needs.
I agree. Dan, you, I know, have some thoughts on that.
Yeah, this is the thing. I suspect that the people at Jobs Ohio and economic development leaders in the major metros would all just love to be able to land some sort of a major plant that was serving EV production, battery production, a major part supplier. And Ohio, it was such a coup for Ohio to attract Honda way back when Governor Rhodes got Honda to bring its motorcycle plant here. And you saw how being open-minded about welcoming a new technology or a new company that may not be familiar can pay big dividends. And I think that and I mentioned that because one of the barriers to adoption of electric vehicles, a bunch of the barriers are kind of easing naturally. They're getting cheaper. They're going to be as expensive as an internal combustion engine vehicle fairly soon. We're getting more charging stations. Battery ranges are getting longer. But one of the elements that is an important part of this transition is people just kind of crossing that threshold where they think, well, heck, I want to buy that vehicle. That vehicle's affordable. It meets all my needs. It's sold at a dealer that I like or that's near me. And part of that, for kind of customers being willing to really consider an electric vehicle, it's just this process of kind of normalizing electric vehicles. And in a state like Ohio, which is the second biggest automotive employment state in the country behind Michigan, or at least it was the last time I checked, it's one element is a lot of people work for an automaker or they work for an auto supplier and it's like that. So that means that kind of traditional autos kind of go pretty deep in our culture here. And that's something that if you really want to have a transportation transition, it's a matter of kind of bringing as many of those players along as you can and kind of helping them make a transition to continuing to exist and hopefully grow, doing things maybe differently.
Right. We have a question from chat, from the chat room, and that is, how does public transportation, we're going to continue here on our transportation conversation, how does that fit into just transition?
That's a huge issue, because public transportation is necessary for a lot of lower, even middle income families in order to get to their jobs. And it's not just a city of Cleveland, Columbus, Cincinnati thing, although we've got, like, you know, the big buses that going on. But it's in rural areas as well. Ohio, the last time I checked, lagged woefully behind. We were like bottom 10 in terms of dollars per capita spent on public transportation. And then, you know, add in the fact that you're looking at having more spacing on buses, at least until we get a vaccine. It's got to be a challenge, but I think it has to be addressed. And it has to be addressed in a way that perhaps is not necessarily going to be as dependent on, well, let me back up. It's going to take a shift in how public funding for transportation goes, because right now the bulk of those dollars are going to roads and other projects that support cars.
Right. And this is a state that has talked about high-speed rail for as long as I've been working in Ohio politics, and you know, it never happens. So, Dan, what about you?
So I don't envy those that are working to improve funding for public transit in Ohio, because there are just so many challenges. Now, of course, we used to have much more robust public transit in the major cities in Ohio, and that went away. So it isn't like Columbus is somehow incapable of having robust public transit. But one of the kind of fundamental truths that people would need to grasp is that an effective transit system that serves the economy and serves workers, it does not break even. It needs to be heavily subsidized. If it's going to be good enough, people actually want to use it. And you can just get into this really self-defeating discussion of like, oh my goodness, this system in our city lost X dollars last year. And yeah, I mean, there is a real need, just simply as far as getting workers to work, and there's this kind of broader issue of just the way cities are built, and the way that you almost need a car to get around cities. It's like if looking in terms of kind of the economic viability of major Ohio metros over the next 30 to 40 years, I mean, this is something that's really important, and I don't hear enough discussion of it by our leaders.
Plus, there's been a shift, right, Dan, in terms of how cities are structured. When I first moved to Ohio, the whole transit system was built on this idea that you were filtering in from the east and the west to downtown. And of course, the south side of town is where you had a huge amount of growth taking place. You have a whole satellite area of jobs, and those are very poorly served by public transportation.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, we have another question from chat, from Becca. A few months ago, she attended a panel on just transition at the West Virginia Center for Climate Change. The keynote speaker discussed the importance of looking at community needs more broadly and not just focusing on jobs, as important as jobs are, but looking more broadly at quality of life. Do either of the panelists have thoughts on this?
If my husband were still around, he would probably quote from a famous baseball movie and say, if you build it, they will come.
I love it.
I think if you start having jobs somewhere, you will get a critical mass. You can, you start having the tax base to improve education and to make things more viable. If we had better transportation, you could have more culture going on. More services. I mean, a lot of what we see is a need to have good jobs to fund these quality of life features. When I looked at the closure of the 2 coal-fired power plants in Adams County, studied by Gilbert Michaud and others at Ohio University and University of Maryland, the amount of money that was taken from schools and children's services was huge. And if you can get jobs in there to start supporting that, I think that the quality of life will follow, and will follow very quickly, because people are going to demand that. Dan, what do you think?
So a future story in this series about Germany's energy transition takes a close look at attempts by German coal regions to kind of remake themselves in terms of quality of life, to attract jobs, to attract employers, to attract residents. And it really showed me, and the thing is, this is such a no-brainer for parts of Ohio and parts of West Virginia. And because if you go to southeastern Ohio or eastern Ohio or most of West Virginia, it's just such physically striking country. It is like, it's like if, so there is a real opportunity. And the thing is, when you talk about community needs that aren't necessarily jobs, if you just talk about kind of quality of life issues, recreation, that leads to jobs. They're just different jobs. They might not pay as well, but you're helping to kind of stem brain drain, and you're also helping to draw people in. Also, before I forget, I'm just going to share a link to my, I do a weekly column that everyone who doesn't read it already, who is on this call, would probably like. So you can click a link, and then you can sign up to get in your inbox every week. But yeah. And
I'll make sure to share that with our audience as well. Thank you, Dan. And that you see stories now that say that a lot of younger professionals aren't making decisions based on salary alone, that they are looking at some of the other features of the places where they want to live and raise their families. So I do think there's a lot to be said for looking at the broader picture. I think, let's see, there's, we've talked a lot about the economy overall, and it's the economics of renewable energy is hotly debated. It's frequently misunderstood. Who passed, economics in college? Barely everybody. We hear people say that that renewables are becoming more competitive with fossil fuels, which is true. But then there are other people who would say, well, that's only because of subsidies. If there weren't for subsidies, that's the only thing keeping renewables alive. So I'm going to start with Dan. How do you think that the federal government's massive COVID-19 relief, I mean, the money that's being put into that, how is that going to affect decision-making down the road in terms of support for incentives? And what role do subsidies really play? I mean, do we really know?
There's this fascinating conversation that goes on, particularly within solar industry, but also you can see it in wind as well, which is that solar has gotten so inexpensive that it's price competitive in much of the country without subsidies. But if you want more of something, if you subsidize it and make it less expensive, presumably more of it will get built. And policymakers in a lot of places want more solar. So you still continue to see subsidies. You still have some very important, in terms of just the economics of their industries, federal tax credits that are phasing out. But there are definitely people in the solar industry who just say, my goodness, we can compete on price. So, and the whole idea of this being a subsidized resource is something that affects solar in policy debates. So if we're talking about kind of what the government could do to help nudge the energy transition forward, I almost think, I mean, you certainly could find ways to subsidize wind and solar, but I mean, heavy investments in the grid or making it easier for utilities to make the grid more resilient, to build more interstate transmission lines, to maybe incentives for energy storage so that you can have a grid that relies more on wind and solar, and investments in energy storage research, not pumping billions of dollars into projects, but like figuring out how to do batteries that don't use rare earth metals, how to do batteries that last a really long time and that don't deteriorate quickly. So if, in terms of kind of what an effective stimulus might look like, those are all things that might work. But I think so much of the kind of actual debate is there's this current subsidy and we like it, let's extend it 2 more years. Yeah.
Kathy?
Yeah, as I think about it, I think one of the things that comes to my mind is this whole concept of framing, that a subsidy implies that you're being, propped up, supported when you can't support yourself. Maybe, another way of looking at it is this is compensation for an attribute that policymakers want to procure. So perhaps cleaner air. Maybe it's compensation for cleaner air. Maybe on the flip side, if you don't have strict regulations that are, going to remove more particulates from the air than there are now, maybe that's giving a pass or letting somebody else freeload by letting them just kind of externalize this cost on the rest of society. So I think there's 2 ways of looking at a subsidy, and at this point there is no very good way that we are either compensating for clean energy attributes or charging for the costs of pollution. And that's been a tension that's been going on for a while. So it may be something where people start saying, okay, not only can we compete on costs, but we're providing extra value if they want to make a pitch to policymakers. Again, that's going to be a tough sell, but I think it may be another way of looking at it.
And of course, the fossil fuel industry has historically received significant subsidies throughout its history, as has nuclear power. So, but that isn't always the argument you want to make, I don't think. But it's true that compared to subsidies in those industries, the renewable energy subsidies are relatively slim. We're getting toward 1 o'clock. We have 2 more questions that came in on chat. If people need to leave, I certainly understand. Dan and Kathy, if you could just stay for a second. Mm-hmm. And I'm going to ask these sort of together. We have, one of them is about wind and one of them is about solar. The solar question is, what do you think is the future of community solar and virtual net metering? And the other is, why are farmers not more supportive of wind farms? Because generally, and I think one of you mentioned this already, wind farms are frequently, I think it was Dan's grandfather, wind farms are frequently located in rural areas on agricultural land. So those are the last 2 questions, and I will let you both give brief answers to them before we close and say a few concluding words.
Okay.
You want to go first, Kathy?
Yeah, I think on the wind resources in the northwestern part of the state, I don't know if one could say that farmers are not more supportive. I think it varies from person to person. I see we have Dale Arnold on the call with the Ohio Farm Bureau, and he certainly knows more directly how farmers weigh in than I do. But I think one of the issues that I've also seen is that there's very good mobilization where you can't really get to what the funding is or how that's being organized, and perhaps disproportionate value of that compared to what different people are doing. So that's one of the problems that I see. Not necessarily that there isn't strong support for it, but there are barriers to it in various policy programs, and also in terms of some of the mobilization that's going on for a number of opponents who may or may not be as large as their volume suggests. And on the solar, community solar, I think there will be more support for that coming forward, but Ohio so far has not had very good policy for that. And I know there's a study out next month that looks at what are the different policy barriers and how do states measure up, and improvements in net metering and better organization might well help boost a lot of that. And I'll be reporting on the studies. So
Good. We look forward to that, Dan.
So community solar, I would say community solar's future is bright in Ohio because it meets a need. Community solar meaning kind of subscription-based solar arrays where people who don't necessarily have roofs that can have solar can somehow benefit financially and contribute to clean energy. It's just a matter of time until, as unfortunately is often the case, Ohio won't be first. They probably won't even be 20th. I say they, I've lived here more than a decade. We won't be first, we won't even be 20th. But the economic forces, the consumer preference forces will be too strong. And way too late in the game, Ohio will finally, it'll be some of the metros leading. And I think, I wanna say Columbus is doing something more on this, but as far as wind resources in Northwest Ohio, I've written a fair amount about wind in Northwest Ohio, and I think in my experience, the people who really oppose wind farms are people who live in rural areas but are not farmers. You know, it's not like they have 300 acres or 1,000 acres or 2,000 acres, and they're making a ton of money from wind farm leases. No, those people love wind turbines. You know, and for the most part, if there's an exception, I haven't met them. I'm sure there is an exception, but I just haven't met them. The people who really don't like wind and are organized with their neighbors are, for the most part, someone who has a house where they're looking at all those wind turbines, but they don't own land, they don't have leases. Their income is nearly non-existent. They might get like some sort of what the wind developers call a good neighbor agreement income that they probably refuse to sign out of principle. But I don't blame them. You know, if I was looking at 100 wind turbines out my front yard with blinking red lights, I wouldn't like, and I wasn't getting hardly any income for it. I wouldn't like it much either. And that's a policy issue of how do you make it so that the people who actually have to look at these resources benefit from having them in their communities, more so than just the landowner. And I think if you really want to get broad support for wind energy in rural Ohio, it's a matter of just making sure that everyone that sees these gets a direct benefit in some way, more so than they do now.
That's interesting. Thank you. Thank you all for joining us. Our time is up and even over a little bit. If you had questions that didn't get asked or answered, please write to me, let me know, and I will try to see if I can get an answer for you. My email address is director@greenenergyohio.org. And I hope you will plan to come back for our next conversation, which is June 11th, where we will be hearing from the business community. Jeff Greenfield from Third Sun Solar and Steve Malink of the Malink Corporation will be joining us. I want to thank Kathy and Dan so much for kicking off this series. It was a great way to begin. You have shared so much of your thoughts and experience, and we look forward to reading all those articles that you've talked about that are coming along. So thank you all, and have a very good day.
Thank you.